of private interests for the next 20 years. Even worse is that the initial money to begin the bank was taken from the government's initial 20% upfront investment. Through that investment, the bank used fractional reserve banking to lend the money that would be used for private investors to put up the remaining 80% needed for the rest of the shares. Not only were the shares obtained fraudulently, but the investors themselves were kept secret. Just like the Bank of England, the first bank of the United States was designed to put the American people into perpetual debt. Soon after the bank was given its 20-year charter, the U.S. government began borrowing from the bank and would find itself in an increasing amount of debt, just as the powers behind the bank's creation had planned. The bank would only benefit its few unknown private investors, including Hamilton himself. Hamilton was a banker, having founded the Bank of New York in 1784, which exists today as the Bank of New York Mellon. Hamilton's involvement with the private banking industry and his involvement as the Secretary of Treasury would set the precedent of bankers dominating the U.S. Treasury Department. This practice has continued until present day. Even though the bankers were successful in setting up their central bank, gold and silver would still play a key role in the U.S. economy. Alongside the establishment of the first Bank of the United States, a national mint was established to strike coins. The Coin Act of 1792 established monetary units for coins, including the eagle and the dollar. This piece of legislation actually defined the value of monetary units and established the dollar as the primary monetary unit of the United States, and essentially put the dollar on a silver standard. Knowing the history of the Roman Empire, the Founding Fathers included a provision that would impose the penalty of death on any employee of the mint caught debasing the coinage for their own personal gain. In 1811, the first Bank of the United States came under an increasing amount of criticism due to rising prices and increasing government debt. When it was time to renew the charter of the bank, Congress decided not to do so. As the United States broke free from their control of a private central bank, the money changers were not pleased. Months later, the British, which had long since been controlled by the Bank of England, attacked the United States, and the War of 1812 had begun. The war would not go well for the British, as their primary focus continued to be on Europe, which was being ravaged by war. In 1803, the third U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, and the French military leader Napoleon would strike a land purchase deal called the Louisiana Purchase. In the deal, the United States would give France a down payment of $3 million worth of gold in exchange for the rights of a large chunk of land west of the Mississippi River that stretched into the Rocky Mountains. Napoleon decided it would be more prudent to use the funds from the sale to raise an army that would challenge the British than to seek French domination of North America. Napoleon believed that the land would allow America to rise into a great naval power that would eventually challenge the British for naval superiority. As Napoleon waged war in Europe, the financiers at the Bank of England would finance armies of their own to challenge him. It was during this time that the Rothschild family would generate tremendous profits for themselves through numerous wartime investments. Napoleon would eventually conquer most of Europe, but would soon face disaster due to British attacks from Spain and a failed invasion of Russia. In 1814, his army was finally defeated, and he was exiled to the island of Elba. Soon after, in 1815, Napoleon escaped his exile and returned to France. The troops hailed Napoleon as their emperor, and France prepared for war yet again. Napoleon quickly raised an army, while the British and their allies scrambled to oppose him. Finally, the decisive battle at Waterloo between the British forces led by Duke Wellington and the French forces led by Napoleon would take place. Nathan Rothschild knew that the outcome of the battle would have important consequences for the future of his business. Wellington's army would eventually defeat Napoleon, but Rothschild would learn of this news a full day before it arrived in London. Rumors abounded in London that Napoleon had won and not Wellington. Rothschild even began selling his stock, which contributed to the ongoing panic, but was secretly buying the depressed assets through his agents for pennies on the dollar. When official word came that Wellington had won and not Napoleon, Rothschild would soon not only dominate the London Stock Exchange, but the Bank of England as well. The story of how Rothschild was able to learn Napoleon's defeat before anybody else is the subject of much debate. Some have said that Rothschild or one of his trusted agents was present at Waterloo and managed to race back to London with information on the battle's outcome prior to the arrival of Wellington's courier. Some believe the use of carrier pigeons enabled Rothschild to transmit information back and forth at a faster pace than anyone else. This was depicted in the 1934 film, The House of Rothschild.
Too late, Mr. Rothschild. You backed the wrong horse this time. Rothschild, you've lost your luck. Michael. Bye. Bye. Yes, bye.
Have you had any news? What do you think about this rumor?
I don't listen to rumors, Mr. Baring.
You hear what they say? Wellington defeated. You mind telling me what you're going to do?
I have no objection to all London knowing what I'm going to do. I'm fine. Mrs. Rothschild asked me to give you this. Did she come here to the exchange? So? Yes.
Look at Rothschild. Did you ever see such a cold-blooded fish? Puts a flower in his coat as he stands on the scaffold with a rope around his neck.
News. Just arrived.
Wellington victorious at Waterloo. Napoleon defeated. The war is over. Gentlemen, listen, listen. I have news. News from Waterloo. Napoleon is beaten. You've been overfine. Don't play tricks on us. It's Waterloo. It is true. Wellington has won at Waterloo. Where? How did you get the news? Yes, how did you get the news? I carry a pigeon. My pigeon post from the battlefield. Now you know our secret. Now will you buy? Buy with every security you have. Buy without security. Buy with your clothes on your back. Buy.
Historians for years have argued the specifics of how Rothschild obtained his great fortune following the Battle of Waterloo, but it is largely irrelevant. Following Wellington's victory, the Rothschild family would become the richest in Europe and would dominate European financial affairs. In fact, the Rothschild family became so wealthy that Nathan Rothschild would successfully bail out the Bank of England during the mid-1820s, following a series of bank failures and a run on gold. As a result of the War of 1812, inflation had increased due to private banks creating an excessive amount of paper money. The U.S. government also found itself in a tremendous amount of debt due to its efforts to finance the war. James Madison, who was still president, initially opposed the First Bank of the United States. However, under pressure to do something about the financial crisis, Madison would cave in and authorize the charter for the Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States was really no different than the First Bank of the United States. It was privately owned, its ownership was largely kept secret, it had the authority to create money out of nothing, and could practice fractional reserve banking. The bank was granted a 20-year federal charter. Despite inflation and debt, the U.S. economy was starting to grow, primarily due to the fact that Europe was still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars. The Second Bank of the United States would immediately aid U.S. expansion by issuing an excessive amount of loans. Then after issuing these loans and creating an economic bubble, the bank would call in many of its loans, thus contracting the money supply. The sudden contraction in the money supply resulted in the Panic of 1819. Following almost a decade of market manipulation by the central bank, the American people had enough and elected Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, as the 7th President of the United States. Jackson was elected into office primarily on his promise to abolish the bank. Jackson first started by firing large sums of government employees, hoping in part to remove corrupt government bureaucrats who were on the payroll of the bank. Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president, knowing of Jackson's opposition to the bank, decided to seek a recharter of the bank 4 years early. Biddle was aided in these efforts by Jackson's political opponent, Senator Henry Clay, hoping that they could use the issue to defeat Jackson in his bid for a second term. Congress would eventually pass a bill reauthorizing the bank's charter and sent it to Jackson. Jackson vetoed the bill, stating that the bank centralized far too much financial power into a single institution and exposed the government to control by foreign interests which held stock in the bank. The public approved of Jackson's veto and was re-elected, despite the bankers financing the campaign of Henry Clay, who ran on a pro-bank platform. Following his re-election, Jackson sought to weaken the bank further and began withdrawing government funds out of the bank and moved them into state banks. Louis McLean, his Secretary of the Treasury, was favorable to the bank and refused, so Jackson fired him. His new Secretary of Treasury, William Duane, delayed the withdrawal of funds, so Jackson fired him as well. Finally, his former Attorney General, Roger Taney, was given the position and agreed. Taney would begin transferring government funds to the state banks. The bank had lost its biggest depositor, which angered Biddle. Amazingly, Biddle even threatened to engineer a crisis in order to facilitate the recharter of the bank. Biddle, as promised, would facilitate a depression by intentionally restricting the money supply in the hopes that the crisis would lead to a rechartering of the bank. Biddle called in existing loans and refused to grant any additional loans. This effectively shrank the money supply, and the United States was thrown into a financial crisis. Biddle even had the nerve to blame Jackson for the crisis due to his involvement in removing government funds from the bank, despite the fact that Biddle was the one who created the entire crisis through the bank's monetary policy. The crisis led to Jackson being censured by the Senate for withdrawing government funds from the bank. Despite the censure, Biddle's public boasting of intentionally crashing the economy turned the tide against the bank. A second attempt to recharter the bank would eventually fail in Congress, and a committee was formed to investigate if the bank had intentionally created the economic crisis. The second defeat of the bank's recharter and congressional approval for an investigation into the bank would lead to the final demise of the Second Bank of the United States. Biddle refused to cooperate with the investigative committee, which would eventually lead to criminal charges of fraud being brought against him. Meanwhile, Jackson paid off the national debt and would become the first and thus far only U.S. president to pay off the national debt in full. Jackson's role against the bank is widely believed to have been a primary cause of an assassination attempt against him in 1835. The assassin's 2 pistols misfired and the assassin was arrested. Later, the assassin would brag that high-profile European interests put him up to the task of killing Jackson, no doubt due to his efforts to destroy their privately owned central bank. In 1836, the bank's charter officially ended, and the bank itself would go bankrupt in 1841. Jackson would consider defeating the bank his greatest presidential accomplishment, and he is still remembered to this day for it. Biddle would eventually be acquitted of criminal charges, but would later die while civil suits brought against him were being heard. After the bank's charter ended, money lending was taken over primarily by state-chartered banks. As a result, the banks loaned out an excessive amount of banknotes that were not backed by gold or silver. This resulted in inflation and increasing state debts. In 1836, Jackson required buyers of government lands to pay in gold or silver coins. Demand for gold and silver coins rose, but the local and state banks did not have enough gold or silver coins in reserves to back their paper notes. The banks had overextended themselves by loaning out an excessive amount of paper money with inadequate reserves. This spawned the Panic of 1837. Even though Jackson would be blamed by many for the Panic of 1837, the economic downturn would not have happened if the banks had not loaned out money recklessly through fractional reserve banking. On top of the troubles domestically, the Bank of England, which was now entirely dominated by the Rothschild family, helped to make the crisis worse by refusing to accept any paper instruments associated with the United States. Author Eustace Mullins, in his book The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, contends that their actions were retribution for Jackson not renewing the central bank's federal charter, which the Rothschild family held a large stake in. Despite the economic downturn that followed, the lack of a privately run central bank and large discoveries of silver would help create an economic boom in America during the Industrial Revolution. The European financial elite were not about to give up, however. Despite losing their centralized power in the United States, they immediately set about gaining this power back. Henry Clay, still a powerful member of the U.S. Senate, would attempt twice to push a National Banking Act through in the early 1840s. The legislation would be vetoed both times by John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, despite the fact that Tyler and Clay were both members of the same political party. For his efforts, Tyler would receive numerous death threats throughout the course of his presidency. Even though the Rothschild family had virtually all of their American financial interests destroyed after the Panic of 1837, their agent August Schoenberg would work to restore them in the years to come. Schoenberg would arrive in New York following the aftermath of the financial crisis. He would change his last name to Belmont in an effort to mask his Jewish ancestry. He would found the business August Belmont and Company, and with the backing of Rothschild Credit, immediately began buying up depressed assets. He would quickly become a key figure, linking the financial power of the Rothschild family with American industry and politics. Belmont and his son August Jr. would eventually end up establishing close relationships with the powerful and wealthy. Included would be the Morgan family, whose future patriarch, John Pierpont Morgan, would play a key role in the American banking, steel, and railroad industries, largely on behalf of the Rothschilds. In 1854, J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, established a partnership with George Peabody, the owner of George Peabody and Company in London. Peabody was a Rothschild agent who needed an American working on behalf of their interest. During the Panic of 1857, a financial crisis caused by the collapse of the New York City branch of Ohio Life Insurance and Trust and a sudden collapse in grain prices, Peabody was advanced a large sum of British pounds by the Rothschild-controlled Bank of England. This money was used by Peabody and Morgan to buy up depressed assets for pennies on the dollar. Despite the fact that hundreds of American companies failed in the panic, the Peabody-Morgan firm prospered during a time of great economic turmoil. Besides his relationships with the wealthy, Belmont would become involved in politics by helping finance the successful presidential campaigns of Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. Belmont sought to mirror the success that the Rothschilds enjoyed in Europe by using his financial clout to assert influence over the government itself. In fact, both Pierce and Buchanan are widely considered two of the worst U.S. presidents in the nation's history, as they set the conditions necessary for the nation to descend into civil war. Considering that both Pierce and Buchanan's campaigns were indirectly funded by the Rothschilds, it is clear that these conditions were not set by chance. With no central bank, the best way to put the country into debt was to engineer a war. By weakening the country, it became more likely that a central bank under the control of foreign interest could be reestablished. Although slavery was one of the issues that contributed to the Civil War, it was actually more of a cause of economics and states' rights. Northern states had implemented protective tariffs to prevent Southern states from buying cheaper European goods. Europe stopped accepting cotton imports from the South, which made the cost of goods in the Southern states more expensive. In the election of 1860, Belmont would back Democrat Stephen Douglas for president against Republican Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, whose name wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states, was elected solely on the population strength of the Northern states. By the time Lincoln took office, most Southern states had already seceded and formed the Confederacy. A month later, the Confederacy would fire upon the Union military installation of Fort Sumter, and the Civil War had begun. More pressure was put on Lincoln as France moved their military into Mexico, and the British moved their military to the north in Canada. By these European forces violating the Monroe Doctrine, Lincoln was put in a precarious situation. Not only did he have to deal with the Confederacy, but he also had to deal with European military forces surrounding United States territory. Lincoln needed a way to fund the war, but the bankers offered loans with excessively high rates of interest. Instead of taking the loans, Lincoln declined and determined that the best way to fund the war would be for the government to create its own debt and interest-free paper money. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue $450 million worth of paper notes into circulation called greenbacks. Even though greenbacks were not backed by gold, silver, or any other commodity, the notes were created free from the manipulation of bankers. Greenbacks were declared legal tender in the payment of taxes, which automatically created demand for the paper notes. Lincoln would also receive help from the Russian Tsar Alexander II, who was aware of what the European financial elite were doing. He had already refused to allow the bankers to set up a central bank in Russia and recognized Lincoln's plight. In fact, he would be the target of several assassination attempts until one finally succeeded in 1881. During the Civil War, he ordered his Atlantic Fleet to dock in New York and his Pacific Fleet to dock in San Francisco as a show of support for Lincoln and the Union. If the British made a move against the Union, it would be considered an act of war against Russia. This effectively held off any potential for a British attack against the Union. Unfortunately for Lincoln, the initial allocation of greenbacks authorized by Congress was not enough to win the war. Lincoln needed additional funding and imposed a temporary income tax that led to the creation of the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, which would eventually evolve into the Internal Revenue Service in the 1950s. From the beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase, favored the establishment of a national banking system to help fund the war. Lincoln would eventually authorize two pieces of legislation favored by Chase, the National Currency Act of 1863 and the National Bank Act of 1864, that did just that. Lincoln sought a quick end to the war, and in order to get the funding, opted to go with Chase's plan. The National Currency and Bank Acts would revamp the entire banking system, and is the basis of the system that is in use today. Following the abolition of the Second Bank of the United States, the banking system was decentralized, with many operating state-chartered banks. The National Bank Act of 1864 would again centralize much of the power the bankers lost when the Second Bank of the United States Charter was not renewed. It set up a national banking system in which banks could be chartered by the federal government and authorized to issue banknotes secured by U.S. government bonds. In other words, these banks could only issue money in exchange for government debt. The end result is that the government would never be able to pay off the debt, because if they did so, the money supply would be destroyed. It is this system that was set up under the National Bank Act of 1864 that ensures the government remains in perpetual debt to bankers. But what about the state-chartered banks? The federal government actually began imposing taxes on state banknotes to discourage their use. Initially, the tax was set at 2%, but was later raised to 10%, which effectively ended the issuance of state banknotes and ensured that all banks were centralized under a federal umbrella. By 1865, Lincoln had been re-elected and the Civil War had ended. Despite approving of this new national banking system, Lincoln appeared to have only signed it into law to ensure that the Civil War would end as quickly as possible. It was largely a creation of Chase. Lincoln was wary of the bankers and favored the government issuing money on behalf of the people, seeing it as one of its greatest obligations and creative opportunities. Although the people favored the continued issuance of greenbacks, it was not looked upon favorably by the European bankers because it was money that existed outside of their control. In fact, Lincoln's support of this policy appears to be one of the primary reasons that led to his eventual assassination. Had Lincoln not been assassinated, he would have continued the policy of issuing greenbacks, which would have been detrimental to the bankers' goal of reestablishing a central bank. Lincoln's chief economic advisor, Henry Charles Carey, had actually authored a series of letters to the Speaker of the House of Representatives entitled "The Way to Outdo England Without Fighting Her." The letters called for making the greenback monetary system a permanent fixture and raising the reserve ratio for banks to 50%. With Lincoln gone, the European banking elite would begin work in consolidating their power further. They knew that the issuance of debt-free greenbacks by the federal government would undermine their interests and immediately sought to have them removed. Immediately, Congress began to do the dirty work for the European bankers. Despite popular support for the greenback, Congress in 1866 passed the Contraction Act, which was signed into law by President Andrew Johnson. This bill authorized the U.S. Treasury to begin removing greenbacks from circulation. Despite the legislation, the U.S. Treasury would continue to issue greenbacks, but only in limited quantities. Support for the greenback was so high that it even spawned a new political party called the Greenback Party, which had limited success in winning state congressional races. They also fielded presidential candidates in the 1876, 1880, and 1884 presidential elections. The Greenback Party believed if the government, not the private banks, issued debt-free money, that money would be plentiful and there would be prosperity. Unfortunately, their wishes would not be fulfilled. The bankers also sought to put the United States on a strict gold standard to further reduce the supply of money. Since gold is less plentiful, it is much easier to control and manipulate than other metals like silver. Evidence of this can be seen in an attempt to corner the U.S. gold market in 1869. At this time, it was believed that greenbacks would be bought back by the federal government with gold. A group of speculators, led by James Fisk and Jay Gould, believed they could profit off of this by developing a scheme to hoard gold. Gould and Fisk began by recruiting a man by the name of Abel Corbin, who was the brother-in-law to former Civil War general and now President Ulysses S. Grant. Corbin managed to convince Grant to appoint General Daniel Butterfield as the Assistant Treasurer of the United States, who would then tip the men off when the government intended to sell gold. With this knowledge, large amounts of gold were purchased during the summer, causing the gold price to rise substantially. On September 24, 1869, Grant finally ordered a large sale of government gold. The gold sale caused the gold price to drop substantially, and within minutes caused an untold amount of economic disruption. The day would become forever known as Black Friday. A congressional investigation proved limited, with Fisk and Gould escaping any real legal and financial consequences. Butterfield would eventually resign his position for his role in the scheme. Grant was attacked for the scandal by Henry Adams in an 1870 article entitled The New York Gold Conspiracy. Adams believed that Grant had tolerated, encouraged, and possibly even participated in the cornering scheme. Regardless of Grant's innocence or guilt in the matter, this event proved that the price of gold could be easily manipulated by a small group of people. This fact alone is why the European bankers sought to set up a strict gold standard, because it gave them more centralized control over the U.S. economy. According to a sworn affidavit by respected Colorado businessman Frederick A. Luckenbach, the European bankers employed a man by the name of Ernest Sed to bribe members of Congress to pass legislation demonetizing silver. Sed revealed the plan to Luckenbach at a dinner party. According to Luckenbach's affidavit, Sed was essentially given a blank check by the Bank of England to withdraw any amount of funds necessary to achieve the passage of the bill. A few years later, Congress would pass the Coin Act of 1873, which would be signed into law by Grant. The legislation demonetized silver and effectively put the United States on a gold standard. Prior to 1873, silver could be taken to government mints and struck into coins. By eliminating silver as money, there was a sharp contraction in the money supply. The combination of the Retraction Act, the removal of silver as money, and the bankers refusing to loan out additional money led to the Panic of 1873 and eventually a long, drawn-out depression. The bankers would also successfully demonetize silver in many European countries, which had the same effect in those nations as well. The period following 1873 would become known as the Long Depression. The reduction in money had led towards rampant unemployment and despotism. The people were angry and demanded a return to the greenback system, the remonetization of silver, or any other solution that would increase the money supply. In 1876, the U.S. Silver Commission was formed to investigate the demonetization of silver and its effect it had on the economy. The Commission's report clearly blames the engineered monetary contraction for the Depression. Despite the report by the U.S. Silver Commission, Congress failed to immediately act on their findings. The people were angry and desperate, prompting riots to break out in the streets of many cities. Still, the bankers would not increase the money supply, nixing any attempts to remonetize silver or a return to Lincoln's greenback system. In 1877, a circular was issued by the Associated Bankers of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, signed by James Buell, secretary. This circular was sent to all the bankers in the United States and outlines a centralized lobbying effort by the bankers to prevent a return to the greenback system. Finally, in 1878, some relief would come in the form of the Bland-Allison Act. The bill directed the U.S. Treasury to buy $2 million to $4 million worth of silver and turn them into coins that could be used as legal tender. Despite a veto by President Rutherford Hayes, Congress overrode the veto and the legislation became law. The injection of silver coins into the economy allowed conditions to improve, and by 1879, the U.S. had begun to crawl its way out of the Depression. The Depression had wreaked havoc on lower and middle-class Americans. It was particularly difficult for farmers and miners who relied upon silver as a medium of exchange. Although the Depression was bad for most, it was an opportunity for the rich to get richer. The Depression allowed rich industrialists like Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and others to become even richer. These men were criticized as robber barons in reference to their unethical financial manipulations for the sole purpose of profit. This period of time would become known as the Gilded Age. The rich showcased lavish displays of wealth, while many others struggled to get by. Had it not been for the sharp contraction of the money supply, these men would have likely not accumulated the wealth that they now had. The gold standard and demonetization of silver took power away from the common people and put more power in the hands of the few. By now, the Coin Act of 1873 was called the Crime of 1873, and the public continued to demand monetary reform. In 1880, the people elected James Garfield as the next president. Garfield had a deep understanding of how the monetary system worked. A former Civil War general and congressman, Garfield spoke out about what was happening with the monetary system on many occasions. Garfield would not be president for long, as only 4 months into his presidency, he would be assassinated. Like Lincoln before him, Garfield would have no doubt sought